The mountains of Kunar province held their breath. No wind, no birds, just the kind of silence that precedes something terrible. At forward operating base Viper, a radio operator's hand trembled as he scribbled coordinates that didn't make sense. 124 Navy SEALs, scattered across a valley that intelligence had cleared 3 days prior, were now screaming through encrypted channels about an enemy force that shouldn't exist. The Taliban had learned. They'd waited. And now, in the dying light of an Afghan afternoon, they were closing in from 3 sides with a precision that spoke of foreign training and intimate knowledge of American response times. The quick reaction force was 40 minutes out. Apache were grounded by a sandstorm rolling in from the Pakistani border. Fast movers were already engaged in another sector. The math was simple and horrific. The SEALs had maybe 20 minutes before they were overrun. Captain Nix Harding sat in the operations center, watching faces drain of color. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number 917, was parked on the tarmac with one engine already spooling down from a routine patrol. She'd landed 8 minutes ago. Her flight suit still smelled like jet fuel and recycled air. The watch commander was cycling through options that didn't exist, his voice climbing that register that comes right before panic sets in. Someone mentioned waiting for the weather to clear. Someone else suggested the SEALs dig in and pray. Nix felt her jaw tighten. She'd heard prayers before. They sounded a lot like screaming. She stood. The room didn't notice at first. Captain Nix Harding was 31 years old and had more combat hours in the A-10 than most pilots twice her age, but she was also 5'4", soft-spoken, and had made the mistake of being excellent at her job without making noise about it. Her call sign was Kindling, a joke from flight school, something about her size and the way she'd burned through qualification courses. The name had stuck, weighted with condescension she'd learned to ignore. But right now, standing in that operations center with 124 Americans about to die, Nix Harding wasn't thinking about respect or call signs, or the fact that 3 different commanders had written efficiency reports suggesting she lacked the aggressive instinct for close air support. She was thinking about the 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon built into her aircraft's nose, and how it fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate that could turn a mountain into dust. "I can be overhead in 12 minutes, she said. Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. The watch commander turned. His nameplate read Reynolds, and his eyes held that particular mixture of hope and dismissal that Nix had seen her entire career. "Kindling, the weather's closing in. We need." 12 minutes, she repeated. "I'll go below the weather." Below the weather in Kunar province meant threading a 43,000-pound aircraft through valleys where the walls came close enough to touch, where wind shear could flip you inverted before your brain registered the problem, where one mistake meant your parents would receive a folded flag and careful explanations about acceptable losses. The A-10 was designed for this. Nix Harding had been training for this her entire life. But doctrine said you didn't fly close air support in deteriorating visibility, without forward air controllers who could see the battlefield, without verified coordinates, without backup aircraft, without a dozen things that didn't exist right now. Reynolds looked at her like she was suggesting suicide. "You can't positively identify targets in that soup. You'll be firing blind into." "The SEALs will talk me in," Nix interrupted. "They've got IR strobes, I've got thermals, and the Taliban don't have anti-aircraft missiles in that valley or they'd have used them already. Sir, those men have 12 minutes, maybe less. I can be there maybe." The operations center had gone silent. 30 personnel, all of them now watching this exchange. The weight of judgment pressed down like altitude. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted their boots on the concrete floor. And in that moment, Nix understood that this wasn't really about tactical feasibility or weather minimums or acceptable risk calculations. This was about whether they believed that she, Kindling, the undersized female pilot who'd never crashed a bird but had never been given the hero shots either, could actually pull this off. Reynolds' hand hovered over the radio authorization switch. His career was in that hand. So were 124 lives. The math should have been simple, but the math never accounted for the weight of precedent, for the gravity of doubt, for the way institutions protect themselves by playing it safe even when safety is the most dangerous option available. "If you go down out there," Reynolds said slowly, "we can't get to you, not tonight, maybe not for days." Nix met his eyes. "If I don't go, those SEALs won't need rescue. They'll need Graves registration. 12 minutes, sir, your call." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush, the sun was dropping below the ridgeline. Men were checking their ammunition counts and thinking about home. The Taliban were advancing with the patience of wolves, and Captain Nix Harding was standing at attention, waiting for a man to decide whether her life was worth betting on 124 others. Reynolds' thumb pressed down. "Launch authorization granted. Call sign kindling is cleared hot. God help you, Captain." Nix was already moving. She hit the door at a run, her boots hammering across the tarmac toward where 917 sat like a patient predator. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Kowalski, saw her coming and understood immediately. He'd flown with Nix for 2 years. He knew her pre-flight routine, her superstitions, the way she touched the cannon's muzzle for luck. But there wasn't time for routine now. He was already pulling chocks as she climbed the ladder. "Maintenance status," she called down. "Green across the board, full combat load, 3/4 fuel." Kowalski paused. "Ma'am, the weather is going to make this interesting," Nix finished. She strapped in with the efficiency of 10,000 repetitions, her hands moving through switches while her mind was already in the valley, calculating angles and altitudes. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. It was a flying gun wrapped in just enough airplane to keep it airborne, designed by people who understood that sometimes you need to get low, get slow, and absolutely destroy whatever's in front of you. The titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit could take hits that would down anything else in the inventory. The redundant systems could bring her home on one engine, one elevator, and pure spite. She needed all of that now. The engine spooled up with that distinctive whine that tanked crews joked sounded like a garbage disposal eating a chainsaw. Nix loved that sound. It meant 30mm freedom delivered at 65 rounds per second. Tower cleared her for immediate departure. No traffic pattern, no delay. Just get airborne and go save some lives. She released brakes and felt the Thunderbolt accelerate with the enthusiasm of a truck with wings. Rotation. Gear up. And then she was climbing into air that tasted like dust and distant smoke, the sun bleeding orange across mountains that had killed better pilots than her. Her radio crackled. "Kindling, Viper TOC. Proceed direct to grid November Quebec 78421. Contact Dagger 1 on tactical frequency." "Copy, direct November Quebec, switching." She changed frequency and immediately heard hell. Gunfire in the background, shouting, someone screaming for a medic. Then a voice, tight with control, any station, this is Dagger 1 actual. We are decisively engaged in taking casualties. Need immediate fire support over." "Dagger 1 kindling, single ship, inbound your position. ETA 10 minutes. What's your situation?" There was a pause, then, "Kindling, you're the QRF." She heard the disbelief, heard the hope dying in real time. No package, no fast movers to suppress while she worked, just her. "Affirmative, Dagger, I'm what you've got. Now tell me what you need dead." The voice on the other end belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, and he was 28 years old with 2 daughters in Virginia who were learning to ride bikes. He was currently pinned in a dried riverbed with enemy forces on the ridgeline above, in the tree line to the east, and pushing up the valley from the south. His tactical situation was classified as fucked in the official military lexicon. But he heard something in Kindling's voice, a certainty that didn't match her lone wolf status, and decided to believe. "Enemy forces approximately 200 fighters, mixed small arms and RPGs. They're trying to close with us before air arrives. We've got IR strobes active. Friendlies are in the riverbed. Everything else is enemy. Copy, stay low. I'm coming in fast. Nix pushed the throttle forward and dropped the nose. The A-10 responded like it had been waiting for this its entire life. She descended into the valley system, watching the altimeter unwind through 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The weather was worse than forecasted. Cloud deck at 3,000 with visibility dropping toward minimums. She kept going. At 2,000 feet, she was below the overcast, flying through air thick with dust and moisture. The mountains rose on both sides like the walls of a canyon built by angry gods. She flew by instrument and instinct, trusting the terrain following radar while her eyes scanned for the distinctive orange glow of IR strobes through her targeting pod. There, grid November Quebec. She could see them now, heat signatures clustered in the riverbed and surrounding them, a crescent of enemy positions that was slowly contracting like a fist closing around prey. Dagger 1 kindling, visual on your position, engaging North Ridge, keep your heads down. She rolled inverted, pulled through, and lined up on the northern ridgeline where muzzle flashes sparkled like malevolent stars. The targeting pipper settled over the concentration of enemy fighters. Her thumb hovered over the trigger. This was the moment when training became reality, when all the simulations and range time transformed into mathematics written in depleted uranium. She pressed the trigger, and the GAU-8 roared. The A-10 shuddered, 30mm rounds accelerating through the barrel at 3,300 feet per second, each one capable of penetrating armored vehicles. Against human targets, the effect was absolute. The ridgeline erupted in explosions of dirt and stone, and other things that Nix didn't let herself think about because thinking led to hesitation and hesitation led to dead seals. She pulled off, banking hard to the right, already lining up the next pass. Dagger 1 assessed North Ridge. Kindling, that's good hits. North Ridge is neutralized. We've got movement in the trees east side. Copy, coming around. She flew the pattern like she was conducting a symphony of violence. Identify, engage, assess, reattach. The tree line next. She walked the cannon fire through the foliage, watching through her targeting pod as thermal signatures scattered and fell. The A-10 carried 11 hardpoints, but right now she was using the gun. The gun was personal. The gun was precise. And the gun never ran out of ways to solve problems. On her fourth pass, the radio crackled again. Kindling, Dagger 1, they're pulling back. The southern group is withdrawing. Nix didn't celebrate. She'd been in enough fights to know that withdrawal could mean retreat or could mean repositioning for something worse. She kept the A-10 in a racetrack pattern above the valley, her eyes scanning sectors, her brain processing threats faster than conscious thought. The light was failing now. The sun had dropped below the peaks, leaving the valley in that blue-gray twilight that made everything harder to see. Her night vision equipment helped, but the weather was getting worse. She could feel the wind starting to pick up, could see the cloud deck lowering. Kindling, this is Dagger 1. We're consolidating position and treating casualties. What's your fuel state? Nix glanced at her gauges. She'd been burning fuel like she had an unlimited supply, maintaining high throttle settings to stay responsive. 40 minutes, she said, which was maybe 30 in this weather, and maybe 20 if she had to fight her way out. Copy, the QRF is. Webb paused. She could hear him checking with someone. 45 minutes out, weather's delaying them. The math clicked into place in her head with the finality of a vault door closing. She didn't have enough fuel to stay until the QRF arrived and then make it back to base. Not in these conditions. Not fighting headwinds and flying low to stay below the weather. She could leave now, tank up, and maybe make it back before the Taliban regrouped. But maybe was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Or she could stay, burn through her reserves, and figure out the fuel problem later. Dagger 1, Kindling is staying on station until friendlies arrive. Another pause. Kindling, you'll bingo fuel. Then I'll bingo, but I'm not leaving you. In the operations center back at Viper, Reynolds heard this exchange and felt his stomach drop. Bingo fuel meant the minimum required to reach a safe landing zone. Past bingo meant you were betting your life on fumes and prayer. He keyed his mic. Kindling, Viper TOC. Negative on remaining past bingo. RTB when fuel state requires. Nix heard the order, acknowledged the order, proceeded to develop selective radio problems. Viper, kindling, you're breaking up. Heavy interference. She clicked her radio off and on a few times for effect. Kowalski, listening on the ground frequency, grinned despite himself. He'd seen Captain Harding's brand of calculated insubordination before. She had a gift for knowing exactly which rules to break, and when breaking them was the only right answer. The next 30 minutes passed in a state of controlled vigilance. Nix maintained her orbit, conserving fuel where she could but ready to engage at any second. The Taliban had pulled back but not retreated. She could see them on thermals, regrouping in the draws and dead spaces, waiting for the aircraft to leave. They'd learned patience from years of fighting Americans. They knew about fuel states and response times. They were betting that the lone A-10 would have to abandon its charges eventually. They were betting wrong. At the 20-minute mark, her low fuel warning light illuminated. She had enough to make it back to base if she left immediately and flew a perfect profile. She stayed. At the 10-minute mark, the warning became an alarm, a steady tone that meant she was now committed to whatever came next. The QRF was 15 minutes out. The math was impossible. Kindling Dagger 1. We've got visual on friendly vehicles inbound. You need to get out of here. I'll leave when you're secure, she said. Her voice was calm. Her hands were steady, but her mind was calculating probabilities and contingencies at light speed. There was an auxiliary airstrip 40 miles east, barely more than a dirt road with wind socks. It was listed as emergency use only, no services, no security. But it was flat and it was long enough. Probably. The QRF arrived like cavalry from an old western, a column of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles that looked like angry beetles armed with 50 caliber machine guns. They swept into the valley with practiced aggression, and the Taliban finally decided that discretion was the better part of not getting obliterated. The thermal signatures melted back into the mountains. The immediate threat was over. Kindling Dagger 1, we are secure, get yourself home. And kindling. Webb's voice carried a weight that transcended radio protocol. You saved 124 lives today. We won't forget. Nix pulled the A-10 out of its orbit and pointed the nose toward the auxiliary strip. Her fuel gauge was reading in the single digits. The auxiliary strip wasn't in her GPS database because it was technically civilian and definitely unsupported. She was navigating by map coordinates and hope. The weather was now officially terrible, visibility down to 2 miles, ceiling at 1,500 feet. She descended through the murk, fighting turbulence that tried to flip her into the mountainside. At 5 miles out, her master caution light illuminated, fuel flow interruption. The engine was starting to starve. She reduced power, watching her airspeed bleed off. The A-10 wanted to fly at 400 knots. It would tolerate 200. She was asking it to hang together at 150 while she searched for a strip that might not exist. There, through the haze, a brown scar across the valley floor. No lights, no tower, just dirt and faith. She lined up on final approach with the precision of someone who knew she wouldn't get a second chance. Gear down, flaps full. The A-10 sank toward the earth like a brick with delusions of aerodynamics. She crossed the threshold at 140 knots, flared, and felt the main gear kiss the dirt with a thump that rattled her teeth. Nose gear down, full brakes. The runway was shorter than advertised. Much shorter. She stood on the brakes, feeling the anti-skid system pulse under her boots. The far end of the runway was approaching with aggressive enthusiasm. The A-10 stopped with 100 feet to spare. The engine wound down. Silence rushed in, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the hammer of her own heartbeat. Nix sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to shake. Then she climbed down and kissed the dirt. She was stranded on an unsecured airstrip in hostile territory with no fuel, no support, and no plan for extraction. The sun had set completely. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, and Captain Nix Harding, call sign Kindling, felt absolutely no regret. She pulled out her survival radio and keyed the emergency frequency. Any station, Kindling. Emergency landing at auxiliary strip grid Victor Mike 77. Request recovery and fuel. No casualties, just one very thirsty. The response was immediate. Reynolds' voice, tight with something that might have been anger or might have been admiration. Kindling, Viper TOC. Confirming you disobeyed direct orders to return to base. Negative, sir. Radio malfunction. Couldn't hear the order clearly. Long pause. Fuel truck is inbound. Security detachment is en route. And Captain. Sir. You're probably getting written up for this. Understood, sir. What Reynolds didn't say, what he couldn't say on an open channel, was that she was also probably getting a medal for this. The Navy didn't hand out distinguished flying crosses for following orders. They handed them out for doing the impossible thing that saved American lives. But medals came later, after the paperwork and the investigations and the careful calibration of narratives. Right now, Nix was just a pilot sitting in the dark, watching the stars come out over Afghanistan, thinking about 124 people who would see tomorrow, because she decided that math was optional. The fuel truck arrived 90 minutes later, escorted by a platoon of very nervous infantry who didn't appreciate being sent into the middle of nowhere to rescue a pilot who'd apparently decided that following flight plans was for other people. They secured the perimeter while Kowalski, who'd insisted on coming along because his pilot was his responsibility, supervised the refueling. He didn't say much. Just checked the bird over with his flashlight, making sure she hadn't damaged anything during the emergency landing. How's she look? Nix asked. Like she flew through hell and landed on a prayer, Kowalski said. So normal for you. They flew back to Viper under full darkness, Nix navigating by instruments while Kowalski talked her through the approach on the radio from the fuel truck. She landed smoothly, taxied to parking, and shut down the engines. When she climbed out, there were people waiting. Not just Reynolds, not just the operations staff. There were SEALs. A dozen of them, still in their combat gear, still carrying the dust of Kunar province. They'd hitched a ride on the first helicopter back just to be here. Lieutenant Commander Webb stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had seen too much and still managed to care. He looked at Nix, really looked at her, the way you look at someone who's proven themselves beyond any doubt, and rendered a salute that was regulation perfect and completely sincere. Captain Harding, on behalf of Dagger Element, thank you. She returned the salute. Just doing my job, Commander. No, Webb said. Your job was to return to base when ordered. What you did was stay until we were safe. There's a difference. The other SEALs were nodding. One of them, a Master Chief with 20 years of hard experience carved into his face, spoke up. You know what your call sign's gonna be after this? Nix raised an eyebrow. I'm afraid to ask. Valkyrie, the Master Chief said, because you flew into hell and brought us all back. The name spread through the base like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew the story, how Kindling had become Valkyrie, how she'd flown solo through impossible weather, how she'd stayed past bingo fuel to protect SEALs who were out of options. The story grew with each telling, acquiring the embellishments that turn events into legends. But the core remained true. One pilot, one A-10, and a decision that math said was stupid but conscience said was necessary. 3 days later, Nix was called to the squadron commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs was a fighter pilot who transitioned to the A-10 late in his career and still wasn't entirely comfortable with the mindset required to fly low and slow. He looked at Nix across his desk with an expression that struggled between administrative disapproval and professional respect. You violated direct orders, he said. Yes, sir. You exceeded aircraft limitations. Yes, sir. You risked a multi-million-dollar asset and your own life on a course of action that had minimal probability of success. The SEALs would probably disagree about the success part, sir. Briggs almost smiled. Almost. Captain, you put me in a difficult position. I have to write you up for violating orders, but I also have to forward a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross because what you did, while inadvisable, was also extraordinary. He leaned back. Off the record, how did you know you could pull it off? Nix considered the question. How do you explain the calculus of instinct, the way training and talent and pure bloody-mindedness combine into something that looks like confidence, but is really just the absolute refusal to accept unacceptable outcomes? I didn't know, sir. I just knew that not trying wasn't an option. That's either the most honest thing I've heard all week or the best line of bullshit, Briggs said. Either way, you're grounded pending investigation. 3 days. Use it to rest. You look like hell. She did. She'd barely slept since the mission, her mind replaying every decision, every pass, every moment when things could have gone catastrophically wrong but didn't. The investigation was pro forma, witness statements, aircraft inspections, verification that she'd actually saved lives and not just endangered them for dramatic effect. The SEALs testified. Kowalski testified. Even Reynolds, when pressed, admitted that she'd made the right call even if it was the wrong procedure. The Distinguished Flying Cross came through 6 weeks later. They pinned it on her chest during a ceremony attended by people who'd spent years underestimating her. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication to the protection of ground forces. What it didn't mention was the quiet revolution that happened in the days after Cunnar. Female pilots weren't new. Combat missions weren't new. But the combination of competence, courage, and the absolute shattering of every doubt about whether women could handle the sharp end of combat aviation, that was something different. Other pilots started requesting Valkyrie as close air support. Ground commanders who'd previously been skeptical began specifically asking for her. The A-10 community, which had always been a tight brotherhood, opened its arms a bit wider, not because gender politics demanded it, because Captain Nix Harding had proven what every professional aviator already knew but some still needed reminded. The airplane doesn't care who's flying it, and neither does the enemy. All that matters is skill, judgment, and the willingness to do what's necessary when everything's on the line. She flew 30 more combat missions that deployment. Each one was different. None matched the desperation of Cunnar, but each one added another layer to the reputation that now preceded her. Valkyrie became shorthand for reliability, for excellence, for the kind of pilot you wanted overhead when the world was ending. She got requests for interviews, for features in aviation magazines, for speaking engagements that would have turned her into a symbol and a spokesperson. She declined them all. The work was the point. The SEALs who went home to their families, that was the point. The young pilots, male and female, who saw that competence mattered more than demographics, that was the point. 2 years later, promoted to major, she was selected to attend the prestigious weapons school, the Air Force's equivalent of Top Gun. She graduated top of her class, came back to operational squadrons, and continued doing what she'd always done. Flying the mission, training the next generation, and proving through action rather than argument that excellence has no gender requirement. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb retired from the Navy 5 years after Cunnar. He settled in Virginia, coached his daughter's soccer teams, and never forgot the voice on the radio that had said, "I'm coming in fast," when coming at all seemed impossible. He kept a photo on his desk, one of the official mission photos showing an A-10 banking hard over Afghan mountains, smoke trailing from the gun, a scene captured in the golden hour light that made everything look like it belonged in a museum. On the back he'd written, "Valkyrie overhead, all came home." The Taliban learned too. Learned that Americans had pilots who would stay until the fuel ran out. Learned that close air support wasn't just doctrine, it was a promise kept by people who took their oaths seriously. They adjusted their tactics, became more cautious about engaging when they heard the distinctive sound of an A-10's engines. Fear is a teacher, and the lesson written in 30mm rounds is unforgettable. Captain, then Major, then Lieutenant Colonel, Nix Harding eventually transitioned to teaching at the weapons school. She spent her days passing on everything she'd learned to pilots who were hungry for knowledge and proof that they could make a difference. She taught tactics and weapons employment and aircraft capabilities, but mostly, she taught decision-making under pressure. How to calculate risk against necessity. How to trust your training when your instincts are screaming. How to break the rules that need breaking while honoring the principles that matter. One afternoon, a young pilot, 23 years old, fresh from training, trying to figure out if she belonged, raised her hand during a debrief. "Ma'am, when you were inbound to Kunar and they told you to return to base, how did you know you were right to stay?" Nix looked at her, seeing in that young face all the doubt and determination that she'd once carried herself. "I didn't know I was right. I knew the alternatives were unacceptable. Sometimes that's all you get, not certainty, just a very clear understanding of what you absolutely cannot live with. The trick is trusting yourself enough to act when the math says don't. What if you're wrong? Then you're wrong, but you live with being wrong a lot easier than you live with not trying." The young pilot nodded, absorbing this. Years later, when she was the one overhead protecting ground forces in whatever new conflict had emerged, she'd remember that conversation. Remember that competence was built from thousands of small decisions that accumulated into the one big decision that defined you. Remember that call signs like kindling could transform into Valkyrie if you were willing to bet everything on doing the right thing. The story of Kunar province became part of the lore. New pilots heard it during their initial qualification training. Close air support instructors used it as a case study in risk management and tactical employment. The SEALs turned it into a legend they told in bars and ready rooms, embellishing the details but keeping the core truth intact. One pilot, impossible odds, absolute commitment. The A-10 community adopted it as evidence that their aircraft, ugly, slow, vulnerable to modern air defenses, still had a role to play in modern warfare. Because when you needed to get low, get dirty, and absolutely protect the people on the ground, nothing else matched the Warthog. Nix Harding retired as a full colonel after 24 years of service. She'd accumulated enough flight hours, enough medals, enough respect to fill a career 3 times over. At her retirement ceremony, there were SEALs in the audience, gray-haired now, soft around the middle, but with eyes that still remembered what it meant to hear a Gatling gun singing overhead in the twilight. Webb was there, his daughters now grown and pursuing their own dreams. Kowalski was there, retired himself, proud of every mission they'd flown together. The speech was standard, thank yous and recognition, and the formal transfer of responsibility that marks the end of military service. But afterward, in the quiet moments when ceremonies end and people gather in small groups to remember, Webb approached her one more time. "You ever regret it? Disobeying orders, the investigation, the controversy?" Nix smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd made peace with every decision that mattered. "Marcus, I saved 124 lives that day. I'd burn every regulation manual ever written for that math. No regrets, not one." "Valkyrie," he said, using the call sign that had stuck for 2 decades. "Kindling," she corrected gently. "That's who I was when it mattered. Someone they underestimated right up until the moment I proved them wrong." The sun was setting over the airfield where she'd spent so many years perfecting her craft. The A-10s were lined up on the ramp, their shark-mouth nose arc grinning at the world with predatory confidence. Somewhere, a young pilot was pre-flighting her bird, running through checklists, preparing for the mission that might define her career. Somewhere, ground forces were calling for close air support, trusting that the voice on the radio would keep the promises that uniforms represented. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, or Syria, or Iraq, or wherever Americans were fighting today, The sky was waiting for the next pilot brave enough to fly into it. Nix Harding walked to her car, her flight suit packed away for the last time, her logbook filled with entries that told the story of a career built on competence and courage. She'd been Kindling, the underestimated pilot with the mocking call sign. She'd become Valkyrie, the legend who stayed past bingo fuel. But mostly, she'd been herself, a woman who understood that the only unforgivable failure was the failure to try. The mountains of Kunar province still held their silence. But now, when the sun dropped below the ridgeline and the valleys filled with shadows, that silence carried a memory. The memory of an A-10 banking through impossible weather. The memory of 30-millimeter thunder echoing off ancient stones. The memory of 124 Americans who learned that when your world is ending and you call for help, sometimes help answers with the roar of engines and the absolute certainty that you're not alone. Call sign Valkyrie, overhead and ready, always.